Book 3. The Fascination. 6. Yeobright goes, and the breach is complete. All that evening, smart sounds denoting an active packing up came from Yeobright's room to the ears of his mother downstairs. Next morning he departed from the house and again proceeded across the heath. A long day's march was before him, his object being to secure a dwelling to which he might take Eustacia when she became his wife. Such a house, small, secluded, and with its windows boarded up, he had casually observed a month earlier about 2 miles beyond the village of East Egdon, and 6 miles distant altogether, and thither he directed his steps today. The weather was far different from that of the evening before. The yellow and vapoury sunset which had wrapped up Eustacia from his parting gaze had presaged change. It was one of those not infrequent days of an English June which are as wet and boisterous as November. The cold clouds hastened on in a body as if painted on a moving slide. Vapours from other continents arrived upon the wind, which curled and parted round him as he walked on. At length Clym reached the margin of a fir and beech plantation that had been enclosed from heathland in the year of his birth. Here the trees, laden heavily with their new and humid leaves, were now suffering more damage than during the highest winds of winter, when the boughs are specially disencumbered to do battle with the storm. The wet young beeches were undergoing amputations, bruises, cripplings, and harsh lacerations, from which the wasting sap would bleed for many a day to come, and which would leave scars visible till the day of their burning. Each stem was wrenched at the root, where it moved like bone in its socket, and at every onset of the gale convulsive sounds came from the branches, as if pain were felt. In a neighbouring brake a finch was trying to sing, but the wind blew under his feathers till they stood on end, twisted round his little tail, and made him give up his song. Yet a few yards to Yeobright's left, on the open heath, how ineffectively gnashed the storm! Those gusts which tore the trees merely waved the furze and heather in a light caress. Egdon was made for such times as these. Yeobright reached the empty house about midday. It was almost as lonely as that of Eustacia's grandfather, but the fact that it stood near a heath was disguised by a belt of firs which almost enclosed the premises. He journeyed on about a mile farther to the village in which the owner lived, and, returning with him to the house, arrangements were completed, and the man undertook that one room at least should be ready for occupation the next day. Clym's intention was to live there alone until Eustacia should join him on their wedding day. Then he turned to pursue his way homeward, through the drizzle that had so greatly transformed the scene. The ferns, among which he had lain in comfort yesterday, were dripping moisture from every frond, wetting his legs through as he brushed past, and the fur of the rabbits leaping before him was clotted into dark locks by the same watery surrounding. He reached home damp and weary enough after his 10-mile walk. It had hardly been a propitious beginning, but he had chosen his course, and would show no swerving. The evening and the following morning were spent in concluding arrangements for his departure. To stay at home a minute longer than necessary after having once come to his determination would be, he felt, only to give new pain to his mother by some word, look, or deed. He had hired a conveyance and sent off his goods by 2 o'clock that day. The next step was to get some furniture which, after serving for temporary use in the cottage, would be available for the house at Budmouth when increased by goods of a better description. A mart extensive enough for the purpose existed at Anglebury, some miles beyond the spot chosen for his residence, and there he resolved to pass the coming night. It now only remained to wish his mother good-bye. She was sitting by the window, as usual, when he came downstairs. "Mother, I'm going to leave you," he said, holding out his hand. "I thought you were by your packing," replied Mrs. Yeobright in a voice from which every particle of emotion was painfully excluded. "And you will part friends with me?" "Certainly, Clem." "I'm going to be married on the 25th. "I thought you were going to be married." And then you must come and see us. You will understand me better after that, and our situation will not be so wretched as it is now." "I don't think it likely. I shall come to see you." "Then it will not be my fault or Eustatia's, Mother. Goodbye." He kissed her cheek and departed in great misery, which was several hours in lessening itself to a controllable level. The position had been such that nothing more could be said without, in the first place, breaking down a barrier, and that was not to be done. No sooner had Yeobright gone from his mother's house than her face changed its rigid aspect for one of blank despair. After a while she wept, and her tears brought some relief. During the rest of the day she did nothing but walk up and down the garden path in a state bordering on stupefaction. Night came, and with it but little rest. The next day, with an instinct to do something which should reduce prostration to mournfulness, she went to her son's room and with her own hands arranged it in order for an imaginary time when he should return again. She gave some attention to her flowers, but it was perfunctorily bestowed, for they no longer charmed her. It was a great relief when, early in the afternoon, Thomasin paid her an unexpected visit. This was not the first meeting between the relatives since Thomasin's marriage, and, past blunders having been in a rough way rectified, they could always greet each other with pleasure and ease. The oblique band of sunlight which followed her through the door became the young wife well. It illuminated her as her presence illuminated the heath. In her movements, in her gaze, she reminded the beholder of the feathered creatures who lived around her home. All similes and allegories concerning her began and ended with birds. There was as much variety in her motions as in their flight. When she was musing, she was a kestrel, which hangs in the air by an invisible motion of its wings. When she was in a high wind, her light body was blown against trees and banks like a heron's. When she was frightened, she darted noiselessly like a kingfisher. When she was serene, she skimmed like a swallow, and that is how she was moving now. "You are looking very blithe, upon my word, Tamsy," said Mrs. Yeobright with a sad smile. "How is Damon?" "He's very well." "Is he kind to you, Thompson?" And Mrs. Yeobright observed her narrowly. "Pretty fairly." "Is that honestly said?" "Oh, yes, Aunt. I would tell you if he were unkind." She added, blushing and with hesitation, I don't know if I ought to complain to you about this, but I'm not quite sure what to do. I want some money, you know, Aunt, some to buy little things for myself, and he doesn't give me any. I don't like to ask him, and yet perhaps he doesn't give it to me because he doesn't know. Ought I to mention it to him, Aunt?" "Oh, of course you ought. Have you never said a word on the matter?" You see, I had some of my own," said Thomasin evasively. "And I've not wanted any of his until lately. I did just say something about it last week, but he seems not to remember." "He must be made to remember. You are aware that I have a little box full of spade guineas, which your uncle put into my hands to divide between yourself and Clem whenever I chose? Perhaps the time has come when it should be done. They can be turned into sovereigns at any moment." "I think I should like to have my share. That is, if you don't mind." "You shall, if necessary. But it's only proper that you should first tell your husband distinctly that you are without any, and see what he will do." "Very well, I will. Aunt, I've heard about Clem. I know you're in trouble about him, and that's why I've come." Mrs. Yeobright turned away, and her features worked in her attempt to conceal her feelings. Then she ceased to make any attempt, and said, weeping, "Oh, Thomasin, do you think he hates me? How can he bear to grieve me so, when I've lived only for him through all these years?" "Hate you? No, no," said Thomasin soothingly. "It is only that he loves her too well. Look at it quietly, do. It is not so very bad of him. Do you know, I thought it not the worst match he could have made. Miss Vi's family is a good one on her mother's side, and her father was a romantic wanderer, a sort of Greek Ulysses. Oh, it's no use, Thomasin, it's no use. Your intention is good. But I will not trouble you to argue. I've gone through the whole that can be said on either side, times and many times. Clem and I have not parted in anger. We have parted in a worse way. It is not a passionate quarrel that would have broken my heart. It is the steady opposition and persistence in going wrong that he has shown. Oh, Thomasin, he was so good as a little boy, so tender and kind." "He was, I know." "I did not think one whom I called mine would grow up to treat me like this. He spoke to me as if I opposed him to injure him, as though I could wish him ill." "There are worse women in the world than Eustacia Vi." "There are too many better. That's the agony of it. It was she, Thomasin, and she only, who led your husband to act as he did. I would swear it." "No," said Thomasin eagerly. "It was before he knew me that he thought of her, and it was nothing but a mere flirtation." "Very well. We will let it be so. There's little use in unravelling that now. Sons must be blind if they will. Why is it that a woman can see from a distance what a man cannot see close? Clem must do as he will. He is nothing more to me. And this is maternity, to give one's best years and best love, to ensure the fate of being despised. Oh, you are too unyielding. Think how many mothers there are whose sons have brought them to public shame by real crimes, before you feel so deeply a case like this. Thomasin, don't lecture me. I can't have it. It's the excess above what we expect that makes the force of the blow, and that may not be greater in their case than in mine. They may have foreseen the worst. I am wrongly made, Thomasin," she added, with a mournful smile. "Some widows can guard against the wounds their children give them by turning their hearts to another husband and beginning life again. But I always was a poor, weak, one-idea'd creature. I had not the compass of heart nor the enterprise for that. Just as forlorn and stupefied as I was when my husband's spirit flew away, I have sat ever since, never attempting to mend matters at all. I was comparatively a young woman then, and I might have had another family by this time, and have been comforted by them for the failure of this one son. It's more noble in you that you did not." "The more noble, the less wise." "Oh, forget it and be soothed, dear aunt. And I shall not leave you alone for long. I shall come and see you every day." And for 1 week Thomasin literally fulfilled her word. She endeavoured to make light of the wedding, and brought news of the preparations, and that she was invited to be present. The next week she was rather unwell, and did not appear. Nothing had as yet been done about the guineas, for Thomasin feared to address her husband again on the subject, and Mrs. Yeobright had insisted upon this. One day just before this time, Wild Eve was standing at the door of the Quiet Woman. In addition to the upward path through the heath to Rainbarrow and Mistover, there was a road which branched from the highway a short distance below the inn, and ascended to Mistover by a circuitous and easy incline. This was the only route on that side for vehicles to the captain's retreat. A light cart from the nearest town descended the road, and the lad who was driving pulled up in front of the inn for something to drink. "You come from Mistover?" said Wild Eve. "Yes, they're taking in good things up there. Going to be a wedding." And the driver buried his face in his mug. Wild Eve had not received an inkling of the fact before, and a sudden expression of pain overspread his face. He turned for a moment into the passage to hide it. Then he came back again. "Do you mean Miss Vi?" he said. "How is it that she can be married so soon?" "Oh, by the will of God, and a ready young man, I suppose." "You don't mean Mr. Yeobright?" "Yes, he's been creeping about with her all the spring." "I suppose she was immensely taken with him." "Oh, she's crazy about him, so their general servant of all work tells me. And that lad Charlie looks after the horse. He's all in a daze about it. The stun pole's got fond like of her." "Is she lively? Is she glad?" "Going to be married so soon? Well, "'Tisn't so very soon." "No, not so very soon." Wild Eve went indoors to the empty room, a curious heartache within him. He rested his elbow upon the mantelpiece, and his face upon his hand. When Thomasin entered the room, he did not tell her of what he had heard. The old longing for Eustacia had reappeared in his soul, and it was mainly because he had discovered that it was another man's intention to possess her. To be yearning for the difficult, to be weary of that offered, to care for the remote, to dislike the near. It was Wild Eve's nature always. This is the true mark of the man of sentiment. Though Wild Eve's fevered feeling had not been elaborated to real poetical compass, it was of the standard sort. He might have been called the Rousseau of Egdon. End of chapter 6. Book 3, The Fascination. 7. The Morning and the Evening of a Day. The wedding morning came. Nobody would have imagined from appearances that Bloom's End had any interest in Mistover that day. A solemn stillness prevailed around the house of Clem's mother, and there was no more animation indoors. Mrs. Yeobright, who had declined to attend the ceremony, sat by the breakfast table in the old room which communicated immediately with the porch, her eyes listlessly directed towards the open door. It was the room in which, 6 months earlier, the merry Christmas party had met to which Eustacia came secretly as a stranger. The only living thing that entered now was a sparrow, and seeing no movements to cause alarm, he hopped boldly round the room, endeavoured to go out by the window, and fluttered among the pot-flowers. This roused the lonely sitter, who got up, released the bird, and went to the door. She was expecting Thomasin, who had written the night before to state that the time had come when she would wish to have the money, and that she would, if possible, call this day. Yet Thomasin occupied Mrs. Yeobright's thoughts but slightly as she looked up the valley of the heath, alive with butterflies and with grasshoppers whose husky noises on every side formed a whispered chorus. A domestic drama for which the preparations were now being made a mile or two off was but little less vividly present to her eyes than if enacted before her. She tried to dismiss the vision and walked about the garden plot, but her eyes ever and anon sought out the direction of the parish church to which Mistover belonged, and her excited fancy clove the hills which divided the building from her eyes. The morning wore away. 11 o'clock struck. Could it be that the wedding was then in progress? It must be so. She went on imagining the scene at the church, which he had by this time approached with his bride. She pictured the little group of children by the gate as the pony-carriage drove up, in which, as Thomasin had learned, they were going to perform the short journey. Then she saw them enter and proceed to the chancel, and kneel, and the service seemed to go on. She covered her face with her hands. "Oh, it's a mistake," she groaned, "and he will rue it some day and think of me." While she remained thus overcome by her forebodings, the old clock indoors whizzed forth 12 strokes. Soon after, faint sounds floated to her ear from afar over the hills. The breeze came from that quarter, and it had brought with it the notes of distant bells, gaily starting off in a peal. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The ringers at East Egdon were announcing the nuptials of Eustacia and her son. "Ah, then it's over," she murmured. "Well, well, and life, too, will be over soon. And why should I go on scalding my face like this? Cry about one thing in life, cry about all. One thread runs through the whole piece. And yet we say, a time to laugh." Towards evening, Wild Eve came. Since Thomasin's marriage, Mrs. Yeobright had shown towards him that grim friendliness which at last arises in all such cases of undesired affinity. The vision of what ought to have been is thrown aside in sheer weariness, and brow-beaten human endeavour listlessly makes the best of the fact that is. Wild Eve, to do him justice, had behaved very courteously to his wife's aunt, and it was with no surprise that she saw him enter now. "Thomasin has not been able to come, as she promised to do," he replied to her inquiry, which had been anxious, for she knew that her niece was badly in want of money. "The captain came down last night and personally pressed her to join them today, so, not to be unpleasant, she determined to go. They fetched her in the pony-chaise, and are going to bring her back." "Then it's done," said Mrs. Yeobright. "Have they gone to their new home?" "I don't know. I've had no news from Mistover since Thomasin left to go." "You did not go with her?" said she, as if there might be good reasons why. "I could not," said Wild Eve, reddening slightly. "We could not both leave the house. It was rather a busy morning on account of Anglebury Great Market. I believe you have something to give to Thomasin." "If you like, I'll take it." Mrs. Yeobright hesitated and wondered if Wild Eve knew what the something was. "Did she tell you of this?" she inquired. "Not particularly. She casually dropped a remark about having arranged to fetch some article or other." "It's hardly necessary to send it. She can have it whenever she chooses to come." "That won't be yet. In the present state of her health she must not go walking so much as she has done." He added with a faint twang of sarcasm, "What wonderful thing is it that I cannot be trusted to take?" "Oh, nothing worth troubling you with." "One would think you doubted my honesty," he said, with a laugh, though his colour rose in a quick resentfulness frequent with him. "You need think no such thing," said she, dryly. "It is simply that I, in common with the rest of the world, feel that there are certain things which had better be done by certain people than by others." "As you like, as you like," said Wild Eve, laconically. "It is not worth arguing about. Well, I think I must turn homeward again, as the inn must not be left long in charge of the lad and the maid only." He went his way, his farewell being scarcely so courteous as his greeting. But Mrs. Yeobright knew him thoroughly by this time, and took little notice of his manner, good or bad. When Wild Eve was gone, Mrs. Yeobright stood and considered what would be the best course to adopt with regard to the guineas which she had not liked to entrust to Wild Eve. It was hardly credible that Thomasin had told him to ask for them, when the necessity for them had arisen from the difficulty of obtaining money at his hands. At the same time, Thomasin really wanted them, and might be unable to come to Bloom's End for another week at least. To take or send the money to her at the inn would be impolitic, since Wild Eve would pretty surely be present, or would discover the transaction, and if, as her aunt suspected, he treated her less kindly than she deserved to be treated, he might then get the whole sum out of her gentle hands. But on this particular evening Thomasin was at Mistover, and anything might be conveyed to her there without the knowledge of her husband. Upon the whole, the opportunity was worth taking advantage of. Her son, too, was there, and was now married. There could be no more proper moment to render him his share of the money than the present, and the chance that would be afforded her by sending him this gift of showing how far she was from bearing him ill will cheered the sad mother's heart. She went upstairs and took from a locked drawer a little box, out of which she poured a hoard of broad unworn guineas that had lain there many a year. There were 100 in all, and she divided them into 2 heaps, 50 in each. Tying up these in small canvas bags, she went down to the garden and called to Christian Cantle, who was loitering about in hope of a supper, which was not really owed him. Mrs. Yeobright gave him the money-bags, charged him to go to Mistover, and on no account to deliver them into any one's hands save her son's and Thomasin's. On further thought she deemed it advisable to tell Christian precisely what the 2 bags contained, that he might be fully impressed with their importance. Christian pocketed the money-bags, promised the greatest carefulness, and set out on his way. "You need not hurry," said Mrs. Yeobright. "It will be better not to get there till after dusk, and then nobody will notice you. Come back here to supper, if it's not too late." It was nearly 9 o'clock when he began to ascend the vale towards Mistover, but the long days of summer being at their climax, the first obscurity of evening had only just begun to tan the landscape. At this point of his journey Christian heard voices, and found that they proceeded from a company of men and women who were traversing a hollow ahead of him, the tops only of their heads being visible. He paused and thought of the money he carried. It was almost too early even for Christian seriously to fear robbery. Nevertheless, he took a precaution which ever since his boyhood he had adopted whenever he carried more than 2 or 3 shillings upon his person, a precaution somewhat like that of the owner of the Pit Diamond when filled with similar misgivings. He took off his boots, untied the guineas, and emptied the contents of one little bag into the right boot, and of the other into the left, spreading them as flatly as possible over the bottom of each, which was really a spacious coffer, by no means limited to the size of the foot. Pulling them on again and lacing them to the very top, he proceeded on his way, more easy in his head than under his soles. His path converged towards that of the noisy company, and on coming nearer, he found to his relief that they were several Egdon people whom he knew very well, while with them walked Fairway of Bloom's End. "What, Christian going too?" said Fairway as soon as he recognized the newcomer. "You've got no young woman nor wife to your name to gie a gown piece to, I'm sure." "What do you mean?" said Christian. "Why, the raffle, the one we go to every year." "Going to the raffle as well as ourselves?" "Oh, never knew a word o't. Is it like cudgel playing or other sportful forms of bloodshed?" "Oh, I don't want to go, thank you, Mr. Fairway, and no offence." "Christian don't know the fun of it, and 'twould be a fine sight for him," said a buxom woman. "There's no danger at all, Christian. Every man puts in 1 shilling apiece, and one wins a gown piece for his wife or sweetheart, if he's got one." "Well, as that's not my fortune, there's no meaning in it to me. But I should like to see the fun if there's nothing of the black art in it, and if a man may look on without cost or getting into any dangerous wrangle." "There'll be no uproar at all," said Timothy. "Sure, Christian, if you'd like to come, we'll see there's no harm done." "And no bawdy gaieties, I suppose? You see, neighbours, if so, it would be setting father a bad example, as he is so light-moralled. But a gown piece for 1 shilling, and no black art, 'tis worth looking in to see, and it wouldn't hinder me half an hour. Yes, I'll come if you'll step a little way towards Mistover with me afterwards, supposing night should have closed in, and nobody else is going that way." 1 or 2 promised, and Christian, diverging from his direct path, turned round to the right with his companions towards the quiet woman. When they entered the large common room of the inn, they found assembled there about 10 men from among the neighbouring population, and the group was increased by the new contingent to double that number. Most of them were sitting round the room in seats divided by wooden elbows like those of crude cathedral stalls, which were carved with the initials of many an illustrious drunkard of former times, who had passed his days and his nights between them, and now lay as an alcoholic cinder in the nearest churchyard. Among the cups on the long table before the sitters lay an open parcel of light drapery, the gown piece, as it was called, which was to be raffled for. Wild Eve was standing with his back to the fireplace, smoking a cigar, and the promoter of the raffle, a packman from a distant town, was expatiating upon the value of the fabric as material for a summer dress. "Now, gentlemen," he continued, as the newcomers drew up to the table, "there's 5 have entered, and we want 4 more to make up the number. I think by the faces of those gentlemen who have just come in that they are shrewd enough to take advantage of this rare opportunity of beautifying their ladies at a very trifling expense." Fairway Sam and another placed their shillings on the table, and the man turned to Christian. "Oh, no, sir," said Christian, drawing back, with a quick gaze of misgiving. "I'm only a poor chap, come to look on, an't please you, sir. I don't so much as know how you do it. If so be I was sure of getting it, I would put down the shilling, but but I couldn't otherwise." "I think you might almost be sure," said the pedlar. "In fact, now I look into your face, even if I can't say you are sure to win, I can say that I never saw anything look more like winning in my life." "You'll anyhow have the same chance as the rest of us," said Sam. "And the extra luck of being the last comer," said another. "And I was born with a caul, and perhaps can be no more ruined than drowned," Christian added, beginning to give way. Ultimately Christian laid down his shilling, the raffle began, and the dice went round. When it came to Christian's turn, he took the box with a trembling hand, shook it fearfully, and threw a pair royal. 3 of the others had thrown common low pairs, and all the rest mere points. "The gentleman looked like winning, as I said," observed the chapman blandly. "Take it, sir, the article is yours." "Ho, ho, ho," said Fairway. "I'm damned if this isn't the queerest start that ever I knowed." "Mine?" asked Christian, with a vacant stare from his target eyes. I haven't got neither maid, wife, nor widder belonging to me at all. And I'm afeard it'll make me laughed at. To have it, Master Traveller, what with being curious to join in, I never thought of that. What shall I do with a woman's clothes in my bedroom, and not lose my decency?" "Keep 'em, to be sure," said Fairway. "If it's only for luck. Perhaps 'twill tempt some woman that thy poor carcass had no power when standing empty-handed." "Keep it, certainly," said Wild Eve, who had idly watched the scene from a distance. The table was then cleared of the articles, and the men began to drink. "Well, to be sure," said Christian, half to himself. "To think I should have been born so lucky as this, and not have found it out until now. What curious creatures these dice be! Powerful rulers of us all, and yet at my command. I'm sure I need never be afeard of anything after this." He handled the dice fondly, one by one. "Why, sir," he said, in a confidential whisper to Wild Eve, who was near his left hand, "if I could only use this power that's in me of multiplying money, I might do some good to a near relation of yours, seeing what I've got about me of hers, eh?" He tapped one of his money-laden boots upon the floor. "What do you mean?" said Wild Eve. "Oh, that's a secret. Well, I must be going now." He looked anxiously towards Fairway. "Where are you going?" Wild Eve asked. "To Mistover Nap. I have to see Mrs. Thomasin there, that's all." "I'm going there too, to fetch Mrs. Wildeve. We can walk together." Wildeve became lost in thought, and a look of inward illumination came into his eyes. It was money for his wife that Mrs. Yeobright could not trust him with. Yet she could trust this fellow, he said to himself. Why doesn't that which belongs to the wife belong to the husband too? He called to the pot-boy to bring him his hat, and said, "Now, Christian, I'm ready."
Mr. Wildeve,"
said Christian timidly, as he turned to leave the room,
"would you mind lending me them wonderful little things that carry my luck inside 'em, that I might practise a bit by myself, you know?"
He looked wistfully at the dice and box lying on the mantelpiece. "Certainly," said Wildeve carelessly. "They were only cut out by some lad with his knife, and are worth nothing." And Christian went back and privately pocketed them. Wildeve opened the door and looked out. The night was warm and cloudy. "By gad, 'tis dark," he continued, "but I suppose we shall find our way."
"If we should lose the path, it might be awkward," said Christian. A lantern is the only shield that'll make it safe for us.
Let's have a lantern by all means. The stable lantern was fetched and lighted. Christian took up his gown-piece, and the two set out to ascend the hill. Within the room the men fell into chat, till their attention was for a moment drawn to the chimney-corner. This was large, and in addition to its proper recess, contained within its jambs, like many on Egdon, a receding seat, so that a person might sit there, absolutely unobserved, provided there was no fire to light him up, as was the case now, and throughout the summer. From the niche a single object protruded into the light from the candles on the table. 'Twas a clay pipe, and its colour was reddish. The men had been attracted to this object by a voice behind the pipe, asking for a light. "'Pon my life, it fairly startled me when the man spoke," said Fairway, handing a candle. "Oh, 'tis the Reddle man! You've kept a quiet tongue, young man." "Yes, I had nothing to say," observed Venn. In a few minutes he arose, and wished the company good night. Meanwhile, Wild Eve and Christian had plunged into the heath. It was a stagnant, warm, and misty night, full of all the heavy perfumes of new vegetation not yet dried by hot sun, and among these particularly the scent of the fern. The lantern, dangling from Christian's hand, brushed the feathery fronds in passing by, disturbing moths and other winged insects, which flew out and alighted upon its horny panes. "So you have money to carry to Mrs. Wildeve," said Christian's companion after a silence. "Don't you think it very odd that it shouldn't be given to me?"
"As man and wife be one flesh, 'twould have been all the same, I should think," said Christian. "But my strict documents was to give the money into Mrs. Wildeve's hand, and 'tis well to do things right."
"No doubt," said Wildeve. Any person who had known the circumstances might have perceived that Wildeve was mortified by the discovery that the matter in transit was money, and not, as he had supposed when at Bloom's End, some fancy knick-knack which only interested the two women themselves. Mrs. Yeobright's refusal implied that his honour was not considered to be of sufficiently good quality to make him a safe bearer of his wife's property. "How very warm it is tonight, Christian," he said, panting, when they were nearly under Rain Barrow. "Let us sit down for a few minutes, for heaven's sake." Wildeve flung himself down on the soft ferns, and Christian, placing the lantern and parcel on the ground, perched himself in a cramped position hard by, his knees almost touching his chin. He presently thrust one hand into his coat pocket and began shaking it about. "What are you rattling in there?" said Wildeve.
"Oh, only the dice, sir," said Christian, quickly withdrawing his hand. "What magical machines these little things be, Mr. Wildeve. 'Tis a game I should never get tired of. Would you mind my taking 'em out and looking at 'em for a minute to see how they are made? I didn't like to look close before the other men, for fear they should think it bad manners in me."
Christian took them out and examined them in the hollow of his hand by the lantern light.
"Oh, that these little things should carry such luck, and such charm, and such a spell, and such power in 'em, passes all I ever heard or zeed," he went on, with a fascinated gaze at the dice, which, as is frequently the case in country places, were made of wood, the points being burnt upon each face with the end of a wire. "They're a great deal in a small compass, you think?" "Oh, yes. Do you suppose they really be the devil's playthings, Mr. Wildeve? If so, 'tis no good sign that I be such a lucky man."
"You ought to win some money now that you've got them. Any woman would marry you then. Now is your time, Christian, and I would recommend you not to let it slip." Some men are born to luck, some are not. I belong to the latter class.
Did you ever know anybody who was born to it besides myself?
Oh, yes, I once heard of an Italian who sat down at a gaming table with only a louis, that's a foreign sovereign, in his pocket. He played on for 24 hours and won £10,000, stripping the bank he had played against. Then there was another man who'd lost £1,000 and went to the brokers next day to sell stock that he might pay the debt. The man to whom he owed the money went with him in a hackney coach, and to pass the time they tossed who should pay the fare. The ruined man won, and the other was tempted to continue the game, and they played all the way. When the coachman stopped, he was told to drive home again. The whole £1,000 had been won back by the man who was going to sell.
"Ha, ha, ha! Splendid!" exclaimed Christian. "Go on, go on."
Then there was a man of London who was only a waiter at White's clubhouse. He began playing first half-crown stakes, and then higher and higher, till he became very rich, got an appointment in India, and rose to be governor of Madras. His daughter married a member of Parliament, and the Bishop of Carlisle stood godfather to one of the children. Oh, wonderful, wonderful! And once there was a young man in America who gambled till he had lost his last dollar. He staked his watch and chain, and lost as before, staked his umbrella, lost again, staked his hat, lost again, staked his coat, and stood in his shirt sleeves, lost again. Began taking off his breeches, and then a looker-on gave him a trifle for his pluck. With this he won back his coat, won back his hat, won back his umbrella, his watch, his money, and went out of the door a rich man.
"Oh, 'tis too good! It takes away my breath. Mr. Wildeve, I think I'll try another shilling with you. As I am one of that sort, no danger can come of it, and you can afford to lose."
"Very well," said Wildeve, rising. Searching about with the lantern, he found a large flat stone which he placed between himself and Christian, and sat down again. The lantern was opened to give more light, and its rays directed upon the stone. Christian put down a shilling, Wildeve another, and each threw. Christian won. They played for 2. Christian won again. "Let's try 4, said Wildeve. They played for 4. This time the stakes were won by Wildeve. "Ah, those little accidents will, of course, sometimes happen to the luckiest man," he observed.
"And now I have no more money," exclaimed Christian excitedly. "And yet, if I could go on, I should get it back again, and more. Oh, I wish this was mine." He struck his boot upon the ground, so that the guineas chinked within. "What, you've not put Mrs. Wildeve's money there?" "Oh, yes, 'tis for safety. Is it any harm to raffle with a married lady's money, when, if I win, I shall only keep my winnings, and give her her own all the same, and if t'other man wins, her money will go to the lawful owner?"
"No, none at all." Wildeve had been brooding ever since they started on the mean estimation in which he was held by his wife's friends, and it cut his heart severely. As the minutes passed, he had gradually drifted into a revengeful intention without knowing the precise moment of forming it. This was to teach Mrs. Yeobright a lesson, as he considered it to be. In other words, to show her, if he could, that her niece's husband was the proper guardian of her niece's money.
"Well, here goes,"
said Christian, beginning to unlace one boot.
"I shall dream of it nights and nights, I suppose, but I shall always swear my flesh don't crawl when I think o't."
He thrust his hand into the boot and withdrew one of poor Thomason's precious guineas, piping hot. Wildeve had already placed a sovereign on the stone. The game was then resumed. Wild Eve won first, and Christian ventured another, winning himself this time. The game fluctuated, but the average was in Wild Eve's favour. Both men became so absorbed in the game that they took no heed of anything but the pygmy objects immediately beneath their eyes, the flat stone, the open lantern, the dice, and the few illuminated fern leaves which lay under the light, were the whole world to them. At length Christian lost rapidly, and presently, to his horror, the whole 50 guineas belonging to Thomasin had been handed over to his adversary. "Oh, I don't care, he moaned, and desperately set about untying his left boot to get at the other 50. "The devil will toss me into the flames on his 3-pronged fork for this night's work, I know. But perhaps I shall win yet, and then I'll get a wife to sit up with me o' nights, and I won't be afeard, I won't. Here's another for 'ee, my man." He slapped another guinea down upon the stone, and the dice-box was rattled again. Time passed on. Wild Eve began to be as excited as Christian himself. When commencing the game, his intention had been nothing further than a bitter practical joke on Mrs. Yeobright. To win the money, fairly or otherwise, and to hand it contemptuously to Thomasin in her aunt's presence, had been the dim outline of his purpose. But men are drawn from their intentions even in the course of carrying them out, and it was extremely doubtful, by the time the 20th guinea had been reached, whether Wild Eve was conscious of any other intention than that of winning for his own personal benefit. Moreover, he was now no longer gambling for his wife's money, but for Yeobright's, though of this fact Christian, in his apprehensiveness, did not inform him till afterwards. It was nearly 11 o'clock when, with almost a shriek, Christian placed Yeobright's last gleaming guinea upon the stone. In 30 seconds it had gone the way of its companions. Christian turned and flung himself on the ferns in a convulsion of remorse. "Oh, what shall I do with my wretched self?" he groaned. "What shall I do? Will any good heaven have mercy upon my wicked soul?" "Do? Live on just the same." "Oh, I won't live on just the same. I'll die. I say you are a man sharper than my neighbour." "Yes, a man sharper than my neighbour, a regular sharper." "Poor chips in porridge, you are very unmannerly." "Oh, I don't know about that, and I say you be unmannerly. You got money that isn't your own. Half the guineas are poor Mr. Clem's." "How's that?" "Because I had to give 50 of them to him. Mrs. Yeobright said so." "Oh, well, 'twould have been more graceful of her to have given them to his wife, Eustacia. But they're in my hands now." Christian pulled on his boots, and with heavy breathings, which could be heard to some distance, dragged his limbs together, arose, and tottered away out of sight. Wild Eve set about shutting the lantern to return to the house, for he deemed it too late to go to Mistover to meet his wife, who was to be driven home in the captain's 4-wheel. While he was closing the little horn door, a figure rose from behind a neighbouring bush, and came forward into the lantern light. It was the Reddleman approaching. End of Chapter 7. Book 3. The Fascination. 8. A new force disturbs the current. Wild Eve stared. Venn looked coolly towards Wild Eve, and without a word being spoken, he deliberately sat himself down where Christian had been seated, thrust his hand into his pocket, drew out a sovereign, and laid it on the stone. "You've been watching us from behind that bush?" said Wild Eve. The Rattleman nodded. "Done with your stake," he said. "Or haven't you pluck enough to go on?" Now, gambling is a species of amusement which is much more easily begun with full pockets than left off with the same, and though Wild Eve in a cooler temper might have prudently declined this invitation, the excitement of his recent success carried him completely away. He placed one of the guineas on the slab beside the Rattleman's sovereign. "Mine's a guinea," he said. "A guinea that's not your own," said Venn sarcastically. "It is my own," answered Wild Eve haughtily. "It is my wife's, and what is hers is mine." "Very well, let's make a beginning." He shook the box and threw 8, 10, and 9. The 3 casts amounted to 27. This encouraged Wild Eve. He took the box, and his 3 casts amounted to 45. Down went another of the Rattleman's sovereigns against his first one, which Wild Eve laid. This time Wild Eve threw 51 points, but no pair. The Rattleman looked grim, threw a raffle of aces, and pocketed the stakes. "Here you are again," said Wild Eve contemptuously. "Double the stakes." He laid 2 of Thomason's guineas, and the Rattleman his £2. Then won again. New stakes were laid on the stone, and the gamblers proceeded as before. Wild Eve was a nervous and excitable man, and the game was beginning to tell upon his temper. He writhed, fumed, shifted his seat, and the beating of his heart was almost audible. Venn sat with lips impassively closed, and eyes reduced to a pair of unimportant twinkles. He scarcely appeared to breathe. He might have been an Arab or an automaton. He would have been like a red sandstone statue, but for the motion of his arm with the dice-box. The game fluctuated, now in favour of one, now in favour of the other, without any great advantage on the side of either. Nearly 20 minutes were passed thus. The light of the candle had by this time attracted heath-flies, moths, and other winged creatures of night, which floated round the lantern, flew into the flame, or beat about the faces of the 2 players. But neither of the men paid much attention to these things, their eyes being concentrated upon the little flat stone, which to them was an arena vast and important as a battlefield. By this time a change had come over the game. The Rattleman won continually. At length 60 guineas, Thomason's 50, and 10 of Klim's had passed into his hands. Wild Eve was reckless, frantic, exasperated. "Won back his coat," said Venn slyly. Another throw, and the money went the same way. "Won back his hat," continued Venn. "Oh!" said Wild Eve. "Won back his watch, won back his money, and went out of the door a rich man," added Venn, sentence by sentence, as stake after stake passed over to him. "5 more!" shouted Wild Eve, dashing down the money, "and 3 casts be hanged. One shall decide." The red automaton opposite lapsed into silence, nodded, and followed his example. Wild Eve rattled the box and threw a pair of 6s and 5 points. He clapped his hands. "Ha! I've done it this time! Hurrah!" "There are 2 playing, and only one has thrown," said the Rattleman, quietly bringing down the box. The eyes of each were then so intently converged upon the stone that one could fancy their beams were visible, like rays in a fog. Venn lifted the box, and behold, a triplet of 6s was disclosed. Wild Eve was full of fury. While the Rattleman was grasping the stakes, Wild Eve seized the dice and hurled them, box and all, into the darkness, uttering a fearful imprecation. Then he arose and began stamping up and down like a madman. "It is all over, then?" said Venn. "No, no," cried Wild Eve. I mean to have another chance yet. I must.
But, my good man, what have you done with the dice?
I threw them away. It was a momentary irritation. What a fool I am! Here, come and help me look for them. We must find them again.
Wild Eve snatched up the lantern and began anxiously prowling among the furze and fern. "You are not likely to find them there," said Ven, following. "What did you do such a crazy thing as that for? Here's the box. The dice can't be far off." Wild Eve turned the light eagerly upon the spot where Ven had found the box, and mauled the herbage right and left. In the course of a few minutes one of the dice was found. They searched on for some time, but no other was to be seen.
"Never mind," said Wild Eve. "Let's play with one."
"Agreed," said Ven. Down they sat again and recommenced with single guinea stakes, and the play went on smartly. But fortune had unmistakably fallen in love with the Reddleman tonight. He won steadily, till he was the owner of 14 more of the gold pieces. 79 of the 100 guineas were his, Wild Eve possessing only 21. The aspect of the two opponents was now singular. Apart from motions, a complete diorama of the fluctuations of the game went on in their eyes. A diminutive candle flame was mirrored in each pupil, and it would have been possible to distinguish therein between the moods of hope and the moods of abandonment, even as regards the Reddleman, though his facial muscles betrayed nothing at all. Wild Eve played on with the recklessness of despair. "What's that?" he suddenly exclaimed, hearing a rustle, and they both looked up. They were surrounded by dusky forms between 4 and 5 feet high, standing a few paces beyond the rays of the lantern. A moment's inspection revealed that the encircling figures were heath-croppers, their heads being all towards the players, at whom they gazed intently. "Whoosh!" said Wild Eve, and the whole 40 or 50 animals at once turned and galloped away. Play was again resumed. 10 minutes passed away. Then a large death's-head moth advanced from the obscure outer air, wheeled twice round the lantern, flew straight at the candle, and extinguished it by the force of the blow. Wild Eve had just thrown, but had not lifted the box to see what he had cast, and now it was impossible. "What the infernal!" he shrieked. "Now, what shall we do? Perhaps I've thrown 6. Have you any matches?" "None," said Ven. "Christian had some. I wonder where he is. Christian!" But there was no reply to Wild Eve's shout, save a mournful whining from the herons which were nesting lower down the vale. Both men looked blankly round without rising. As their eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, they perceived faint greenish points of light among the grass and fern. These lights dotted the hillside like stars of a low magnitude. "Ah, glowworms!" said Wild Eve. "Wait a minute. We can continue the game." Ven sat still, and his companion went hither and thither till he had gathered 13 glowworms, as many as he could find in a space of 4 or 5 minutes, upon a foxglove leaf which he pulled for the purpose. The Reddleman vented a low, humorous laugh when he saw his adversary return with these. "Determined to go on, then?" he said dryly. "I always am," said Wild Eve angrily. And shaking the glowworms from the leaf, he ranged them with a trembling hand in a circle on the stone, leaving a space in the middle for the descent of the dice-box, over which the 13 tiny lamps threw a pale phosphoric shine. The game was again renewed. It happened to be that season of the year at which glowworms put forth their greatest brilliancy, and the light they yielded was more than ample for the purpose, since it is possible on such nights to read the handwriting of a letter by the light of 2 or 3. The incongruity between the men's deeds and their environment was great. Amid the soft, juicy vegetation of the hollow in which they sat, the motionless and the uninhabited solitude, intruded the chink of guineas, the rattle of dice, the exclamations of the reckless players.
Wild Eve had lifted the box as soon as the lights were obtained, and the solitary die proclaimed that the game was still against him. "I won't play any more. You've been tampering with the dice," he shouted. "How, when they were your own?" said the Reddleman. "We'll change the game. The lowest point shall win the stake. It may cut off my ill luck. Do you refuse?" "No, go on." "Oh, there they are again, damn them!" cried Wild Eve, looking up. The heath-croppers had returned, noiselessly, and were looking on with erect heads just as before, their timid eyes fixed upon the scene, as if they were wondering what mankind and candlelight could have to do in these haunts at this untoward hour. "What a plague those creatures are, staring at me so!" he said, and flung a stone, which scattered them, when the game was continued as before. Wild Eve had now 10 guineas left, and each laid 5. Wild Eve threw 3 points, then 2, and raked in the coins. The other seized the die and clenched his teeth upon it in sheer rage, as if he would bite it in pieces. "Never give in. Here are my last 5, he cried, throwing them down. "Hang the glowworms, they're going out. Why don't you burn, you little fools? Stir them up with a thorn." He probed the glowworms with a bit of stick and rolled them over till the bright side of their tails was upwards. "There's light enough. Throw on," said Ven. Wild Eve brought down the box within the shining circle and looked eagerly. He had thrown ace. "Well done. I said it would turn, and it has turned." Ven said nothing, but his hand shook slightly. He threw ace also. "Oh," said Wild Eve, "curse me!" The die smacked the stone a second time. It was ace again. Ven looked gloomy, threw. The die was seen to be lying in 2 pieces, the cleft sides uppermost. "I've thrown nothing at all," he said. "Serves me right. I split the die with my teeth. Here, take your money. Blank is less than 1. "I don't wish it. Take it, I say. You've won it." And Wild Eve threw the stakes against the Reddleman's chest, then gathered them up, arose, and withdrew from the hollow, Wild Eve sitting stupefied. When he had come to himself, he also arose, and with the extinguished lantern in his hand went towards the high road. On reaching it, he stood still. The silence of night pervaded the whole heath except in one direction, and that was towards Mistover. There he could hear the noise of light wheels, and presently saw 2 carriage lamps descending the hill. Wild Eve screened himself under a bush, and waited. The vehicle came on and passed before him. It was a hired carriage, and behind the coachman were 2 persons whom he knew well. There sat Eustacia and Yeobright, the arm of the latter being round her waist. They turned the sharp corner at the bottom towards the temporary house which Clym had hired and furnished, about 5 miles to the eastward. Wild Eve forgot the loss of the money at the sight of his lost love, whose preciousness in his eyes was increasing in geometrical progression with each new incident that reminded him of their hopeless division. Brimming with the subtilized misery that he was capable of feeling, he followed the opposite way, towards the inn. About the same moment that Wild Eve stepped into the highway, Ven also had reached it, at a point 100 yards farther on, and he, hearing the same wheels, likewise waited till the carriage should come up. When he saw who sat therein, he seemed to be disappointed. Reflecting a minute or 2, during which interval the carriage rolled on, he crossed the road and took a short cut through the furze and heath to a point where the turnpike road bent round in ascending a hill. He was now again in front of the carriage, which presently came up at a walking pace. Ven stepped forward and showed himself. Eustacia started when the lamp shone upon him, and Clym's arm was involuntarily withdrawn from her waist. He said, "What, Diggory? You're having a lonely walk?" "Yes, I beg your pardon for stopping you," said Venn, "but I am waiting about for Mrs. Wildeve. I have something to give her from Mrs. Yeobright. Can you tell me if she's gone home from the party yet?" "No, but she'll be leaving soon. You may possibly meet her at the corner." Venn made a farewell obeisance and walked back to his former position, where the by-road from Mistover joined the highway. Here he remained fixed for nearly half an hour, and then another pair of lights came down the hill. It was the old-fashioned wheeled nondescript belonging to the captain, and Thomasin sat in it alone, driven by Charlie. The Reddleman came up as they slowly turned the corner. "I beg pardon for stopping you, Mrs. Wildeve," he said, "but I have something to give you privately from Mrs. Yeobright." He handed a small parcel. It consisted of the 100 guineas he had just won, roughly twisted up in a piece of paper. Thomasin recovered from her surprise and took the packet. "That's all, ma'am. I wish you good night," he said, and vanished from her view. Thus Venn, in his anxiety to rectify matters, had placed in Thomasin's hands not only the 50 guineas which rightly belonged to her, but also the 50 intended for her cousin Clym. His mistake had been based upon Wildeve's words at the opening of the game, when he indignantly denied that the guineas were not his own. It had not been comprehended by the Reddleman that at halfway through the performance the game was continued with the money of another person, and it was an error which afterwards helped to cause more misfortune than treble the loss in money value could have done. The night was now somewhat advanced, and Venn plunged deeper into the heath till he came to a ravine where his van was standing, a spot not more than 200 yards from the site of the gambling bout. He entered this movable home of his, lit his lantern, and, before closing his door for the night, stood reflecting on the circumstances of the preceding hours. While he stood, the dawn grew visible in the northwest quarter of the heavens, which, the clouds having cleared off, was bright with a soft sheen at this midsummer time, though it was only between 1 and 2 o'clock. Venn, thoroughly weary, then shut his door and flung himself down to sleep. End of chapter. End of Book 3. Recorded by Graham at Plum Hill on the 15th of May 2006 in Shropshire, England. Book 4. The Closed Door. 1. The Rencounter by the Pool. The July sun shone over Egdon, and fired its crimson heather to scarlet. It was the one season of the year and the one weather of the season in which the heath was gorgeous. This flowering period represented the second or noontide division in the cycle of those superficial changes which alone were possible here. It followed the green or young fern period representing the morn, and preceded the brown period, when the heath bells and ferns would wear the russet tinges of evening, to be in turn displaced by the dark hue of the winter period, representing night. Clym and Eustacia, in their little house at Alderworth, beyond East Egdon, were living on with a monotony which was delightful to them. The heath and changes of weather were quite blotted out from their eyes for the present. They were enclosed in a sort of luminous mist, which hid from them surroundings of any inharmonious colour, and gave to all things the character of light. When it rained, they were charmed, because they could remain indoors together all day, with such a show of reason. When it was fine, they were charmed, because they could sit together on the hills. They were like those double stars which revolve round and round each other, and from a distance appear to be one. The absolute solitude in which they lived intensified their reciprocal thoughts. Yet some might have said that it had the disadvantage of consuming their mutual affections at a fearfully prodigal rate. Yeobright did not fear for his own part, but recollection of Eustatia's old speech about the evanescence of love, now apparently forgotten by her, sometimes caused him to ask himself a question, and he recoiled at the thought that the quality of finiteness was not foreign to Eden. When 3 or 4 weeks had been passed thus, Yeobright resumed his reading in earnest. To make up for lost time he studied indefatigably, for he wished to enter his new profession with the least possible delay. Now Eustatia's dream had always been that once married to Clym, she would have the power of inducing him to return to Paris. He had carefully withheld all promise to do so, but would he be proof against her coaxing and argument? She had calculated to such a degree on the probability of success that she had represented Paris, and not Budmouth, to her grandfather as, in all likelihood, their future home. Her hopes were bound up in this dream. In the quiet days since their marriage, when Yeobright had been poring over her lips, her eyes, and the lines of her face, she had mused and mused on the subject, even while in the act of returning his gaze. And now the sight of the books, indicating a future which was antagonistic to her dream, struck her with a positively painful jar. She was hoping for the time when, as the mistress of some pretty establishment, however small, near a Parisian boulevard, she would be passing her days on the skirts at least of the gay world, and catching stray wafts from those town pleasures she was so well fitted to enjoy. Yet Yeobright was as firm in the contrary intention as if the tendency of marriage were rather to develop the fantasies of young philanthropy than to sweep them away. Her anxiety reached a high pitch, but there was something in Clym's undeviating manner which made her hesitate before sounding him on the subject. At this point in their experience, however, an incident helped her. It occurred one evening about 6 weeks after their union, and arose entirely out of the unconscious misapplication by Venn of the 50 guineas intended for Yeobright. A day or two after the receipt of the money, Thomasin had sent a note to her aunt to thank her. She had been surprised at the largeness of the amount, but as no sum had ever been mentioned, she set that down to her late uncle's generosity. She had been strictly charged by her aunt to say nothing to her husband of this gift, and Wildeve, as was natural enough, had not brought himself to mention to his wife a single particular of the midnight scene in the heath. Christian's terror, in like manner, had tied his tongue on the share he took in that proceeding, and hoping that by some means or other the money had gone to its proper destination, he simply asserted as much without giving details. Therefore, when a week or two had passed away, Mrs. Yeobright began to wonder why she never heard from her son of the receipt of the present, and, to add gloom to her perplexity, came the possibility that resentment might be the cause of his silence. She could hardly believe as much, but why did he not write? She questioned Christian, and the confusion in his answers would at once have led her to believe that something was wrong, had not one half of his story been corroborated by Thomasin's note. Mrs. Yeobright was in this state of uncertainty when she was informed one morning that her son's wife was visiting her grandfather at Mistover. She determined to walk up the hill, see Eustatia, and ascertain from her daughter-in-law's lips whether the family guineas, which were to Mrs. Yeobright what family jewels are to wealthier dowagers, had miscarried or not. When Christian learned where she was going, his concern reached its height. At the moment of her departure, he could prevaricate no longer, and, confessing to the gambling, told her the truth as far as he knew it, that the guineas had been won by Wild Eve. "What? Is he going to keep them?" Mrs. Yeobright cried. "Oh, I hope and trust not," moaned Christian. "He's a good man, and perhaps will do right things. He said you ought to have give Mr. Clim's share to Eustacia, and that's perhaps what he'll do himself." To Mrs. Yeobright, as soon as she could calmly reflect, there was much likelihood in this, for she could hardly believe that Wild Eve would really appropriate money belonging to her son. The intermediate course of giving it to Eustacia was the sort of thing to please Wild Eve's fancy, but it filled the mother with anger none the less. That Wild Eve should have got command of the guineas after all, and should rearrange the disposal of them, placing Clim's share in Clim's wife's hands, because she had been his own sweetheart and might be so still, was as irritating a pain as any that Mrs. Yeobright had ever borne. She instantly dismissed the wretched Christian from her employ for his conduct in the affair, but feeling quite helpless and unable to do without him, told him afterwards that he might stay a little longer if he chose. Then she hastened off to Eustacia, moved by a much less promising emotion towards her daughter-in-law than she had felt half an hour earlier, when planning her journey. At that time it was to inquire in a friendly spirit if there had been any accidental loss. Now it was to ask plainly if Wild Eve had privately given her money, which had been intended as a sacred gift to Clim. She started at 2:00, and her meeting with Eustacia was hastened by the appearance of the young lady beside the pool and bank which bordered her grandfather's premises, where she stood surveying the scene, and perhaps thinking of the romantic enactments it had witnessed in past days. When Mrs. Yeobright approached, Eustacia surveyed her with the calm stare of a stranger. The mother-in-law was the first to speak. "I was coming to see you," she said. "Indeed," said Eustacia, with surprise, for Mrs. Yeobright, much to the girl's mortification, had refused to be present at the wedding. "I did not at all expect you." "I was coming on business only," said the visitor more coldly than at first. "Will you excuse my asking this? Have you received a gift from Thomasin's husband?" "A gift? I mean money." "What, I, myself?" "Well, I meant yourself privately, though I was not going to put it in that way." "Money? From Mr. Wild Eve? No, never! Madam, what do you mean by that?" Eustacia fired up all too quickly, for her own consciousness of the old attachment between herself and Wild Eve led her to jump to the conclusion that Mrs. Yeobright also knew of it, and might have come to accuse her of receiving dishonourable presents from him now. "I simply ask the question," said Mrs. Yeobright. "I've been—" "You ought to have better opinions of me. I feared you were against me from the first," exclaimed Eustacia. "No, I was simply for Clim," replied Mrs. Yeobright, with too much emphasis in her earnestness. "It is the instinct of everyone to look after their own." "How can you imply that he required guarding against me?" cried Eustacia, passionate tears in her eyes. "I have not injured him by marrying him. What sin have I done that you should think so ill of me? You had no right to speak against me to him when I have never wronged you." "I only did what was fair under the circumstances," said Mrs. Yeobright more softly. "I would rather not have gone into this question at present, but you compel me. I am not ashamed to tell you the honest truth. I was firmly convinced that he ought not to marry you. Therefore I tried to dissuade him, by all the means in my power. But it is done now, and I have no idea of complaining any more. I am ready to welcome you." "Ah, yes, it is very well to see things in that business point of view," murmured Eustacia, with a smothered fire of feeling. "But why should you think there is anything between me and Mr. Wildeve? I have a spirit as well as you. I am indignant, and so would any woman be. It was a condescension in me to be Clim's wife, and not a manoeuvre, let me remind you. And therefore I will not be treated as a schemer, whom it becomes necessary to bear with, because she has crept into the family." "Oh, oh!" said Mrs. Yeobright, vainly endeavouring to control her anger. "I have never heard anything to show that my son's lineage is not as good as the Vy's, perhaps better. It is amusing to hear you talk of condescension." "It was condescension, nevertheless," said Eustacia vehemently. "And if I had known then what I know now, that I should be living in this wild heath a month after my marriage, I should have thought twice before agreeing." "It would be better not to say that. It might not sound truthful. I am not aware that any deception was used on his part. I know there was not, whatever might have been the case on the other side." "Oh, this is too exasperating," answered the younger woman huskily, her face crimsoning and her eyes darting light. "How can you dare to speak to me like that? I insist upon repeating to you that had I known that my life would from my marriage up to this time have been as it is, I should have said no. I don't complain. I have never uttered a sound of such a thing to him, but it is true. I hope, therefore, that in the future you will be silent on my eagerness. If you injure me now, you injure yourself." "Injure you? Do you think I am an evil-disposed person? You injured me before my marriage, and you have now suspected me of secretly favouring another man for money. I could not help what I thought, but I have never spoken of you outside my house. You spoke of me within it, to Clim, and you could not do worse. I did my duty, and I'll do mine, a part of which will possibly be to set him against his mother. It is always so, but why should I not bear it as others have borne it before me?" "I understand you," said Eustacia, breathless with emotion. "You think me capable of every bad thing. Who can be worse than a wife who encourages a lover and poisons her husband's mind against his relative? Yet that is now the character given to me. Will you not come and drag him out of my hands?" Mrs. Yeobright gave back heat for heat. "Don't rage at me, madam. It ill becomes your beauty, and I am not worth the injury you may do it on my account, I assure you. I am only a poor old woman who has lost a son." "If you had treated me honourably, you would have had him still," Eustacia said, while scalding tears trickled from her eyes. "You have brought yourself to folly. You have caused a division which can never be healed." "I have done nothing. This audacity from a young woman is more than I can bear." "It was asked for. You have suspected me, and you have made me speak of my husband in a way I would not have done. You will let him know that I have spoken thus, and it will cause misery between us. Will you go away from me? You are no friend." "I will go when I have spoken a word. If anyone says I have come here to question you without good grounds for it, that person speaks untruly. If anyone says that I attempted to stop your marriage by any but honest means, that person, too, does not speak the truth. I have fallen on an evil time. God has been unjust to me in letting you insult me. Probably my son's happiness does not lie on this side of the grave, for he is a foolish man who neglects the advice of his parent. You, Eustacia, stand on the edge of a precipice without knowing it. Only show my son one half the temper you have shown me today, and you may before long, and you will find that though he is as gentle as a child with you now, he can be as hard as steel." The excited mother then withdrew, and Eustacia, panting, stood looking into the pool. End of Chapter 1. Book 4. The Closed Door. 2. He is set upon by adversities, but he sings a song. The result of that unpropitious interview was that Eustacia, instead of passing the afternoon with her grandfather, hastily returned home to Clym, where she arrived 3 hours earlier than she had been expected. She came indoors with her face flushed and her eyes still showing traces of her recent excitement. Yeobright looked up, astonished. He had never seen her in any way approaching to that state before. She passed him by and would have gone upstairs unnoticed, but Clym was so concerned that he immediately followed her. "What is the matter, Eustacia?" he said. She was standing on the hearthrug in the bedroom looking upon the floor, her hands clasped in front of her, her bonnet yet unremoved. For a moment she did not answer, and then she replied in a low voice, "I have seen your mother, and I will never see her again." A weight fell like a stone upon Clym. That same morning, when Eustacia had arranged to go and see her grandfather, Clym had expressed a wish that she would drive down to Bloom's End and inquire for her mother-in-law, or adopt any other means she might think fit to bring about a reconciliation. She had set out gaily, and he had hoped for much. "Why is this?" he asked. "I cannot tell. I cannot remember. I met your mother, and I will never meet her again." "Why?" "What do I know about Mr. Wildeve now? I won't have wicked opinions passed on me by anybody. Oh, it was too humiliating to be asked if I had received any money from him, or encouraged him, or something of the sort. I don't exactly know what." "How could she have asked you that?" "She did." "Then there must have been some meaning in it. What did my mother say besides?" "I don't know what she said, except insofar as this, that we both said words which can never be forgiven." "Oh, there must be some misapprehension. Whose fault was it that her meaning was not made clear?" "I would rather not say. It may have been the fault of the circumstances, which were awkward at the very least. Oh, Clym, I cannot help expressing it. This is an unpleasant position you have placed me in. But you must improve it. Yes, say you will. For I hate it all now. Yes, take me to Paris, and go on with your old occupation, Clym. I don't mind how humbly we live there at first, if it can only be Paris, and not Egdon Heath." "But I've quite given up that idea," said Yeobright, with surprise. "Surely I never led you to expect such a thing." "I own it. Yet there are thoughts which cannot be kept out of mind, and that one was mine. Must I not have a voice in the matter, now I am your wife, and the sharer of your doom?" "Well, there are things which are placed beyond the pale of discussion, and I thought this was specially so, and by mutual agreement." Clem, I am unhappy at what I hear," she said in a low voice, and her eyes drooped, and she turned away. This indication of an unexpected mine of hope in Eustatia's bosom disconcerted her husband. It was the first time that he had confronted the fact of the indirectness of a woman's movement towards her desire. But his intention was unshaken, though he loved Eustacia well. All the effect that her remark had upon him was a resolve to chain himself more closely than ever to his books, so as to be the sooner enabled to appeal to substantial results from another course in arguing against her whim. Next day the mystery of the guineas was explained. Thomasin paid them a hurried visit, and Clem's share was delivered up to him by her own hands. Eustacia was not present at the time. "Then this is what my mother meant," exclaimed Clem. "Thomasin, do you know they've had a bitter quarrel?" There was a little more reticence now than formerly in Thomasin's manner towards her cousin. It is the effect of marriage to engender in several directions some of the reserve it annihilates in one. "Your mother told me," she said quietly. "She came back to my house after seeing Eustacia." "The worst thing I dreaded has come to pass. Was mother much disturbed when she came to you, Thomasin?" "Oh, yes." "Very much indeed?" "Yes." Clem leant his elbow upon the post of the garden gate and covered his eyes with his hand. "Don't trouble about it, Clem. They may get to be friends." He shook his head. "Not two people with inflammable natures like theirs. Well, what must be will be. One thing is cheerful in it. The guineas are not lost. I would rather have lost them twice over than have had this happen." Amid these jarring events, Yeobright felt one thing to be indispensable, that he should speedily make some show of progress in his scholastic plans. With this view he read far into the small hours during many nights. One morning, after a severer strain than usual, he awoke with a strange sensation in his eyes. The sun was shining directly upon the window blind, and at his first glance thitherward a sharp pain obliged him to close his eyelids quickly. At every new attempt to look about him, the same morbid sensibility to light was manifested, and excoriating tears ran down his cheeks. He was obliged to tie a bandage over his brow while dressing, and during the day it could not be abandoned. Eustacia was thoroughly alarmed. On finding that the case was no better the next morning, they decided to send to Anglebury for a surgeon. Towards evening he arrived, and pronounced the disease to be acute inflammation induced by Clem's night studies, continued in spite of a cold previously caught, which had weakened his eyes for the time. Fretting with impatience at this interruption to a task he was so anxious to hasten, Clem was transformed into an invalid. He was shut up in a room from which all light was excluded, and his condition would have been one of absolute misery, had not Eustacia read to him by the glimmer of a shaded lamp. He hoped that the worst would soon be over, but at the surgeon's third visit he learnt to his dismay that although he might venture out of doors with shaded eyes in the course of a month, all thought of pursuing his work, or of reading print of any description, would have to be given up for a long time to come. 1 week and another week wore on, and nothing seemed to lighten the gloom of the young couple. Dreadful imaginings occurred to Eustacia, but she carefully refrained from uttering them to her husband. Suppose he should become blind, or at all events never recover sufficient strength of sight to engage in an occupation which would be congenial to her feelings, and conduce to her removal from this lonely dwelling, among the hills. That dream of beautiful Paris was not likely to cohere into substance in the presence of this misfortune. As day after day passed by and he got no better, her mind ran more and more in this mournful groove, and she would go away from him into the garden and weep despairing tears. Yeobright thought he would send for his mother, and then he thought he would not. Knowledge of his state could only make her the more unhappy, and the seclusion of their life was such that she would be hardly likely to learn the news except through a special messenger. Endeavouring to take the trouble as philosophically as possible, he waited on till the 3rd week had arrived, when he went into the open air for the first time since the attack. The surgeon visited him again at this stage, and Clym urged him to express a distinct opinion. The young man learnt with added surprise that the date at which he might expect to resume his labours was as uncertain as ever, his eyes being in that peculiar state which, though affording him sight enough for walking about, would not admit of their being strained upon any definite object without incurring the risk of reproducing ophthalmia in its acute form. Clym was very grave at the intelligence, but not despairing. A quiet firmness and even cheerfulness took possession of him. He was not to be blind. That was enough. To be doomed to behold the world through smoked glass for an indefinite period was bad enough and fatal to any kind of advance, but Yeobright was an absolute stoic in the face of mishaps which only affected his social standing, and apart from Eustacia, the humblest walk of life would satisfy him, if it could be made to work in with some form of his culture scheme. To keep a cottage night school was one such form, and his affliction did not master his spirit as it might otherwise have done. He walked through the warm sun westward into those tracts of Egdon with which he was best acquainted, being those lying nearer to his old home. He saw before him in one of the valleys the gleaming of whetted iron, and advancing dimly perceived that the shine came from the tool of a man who was cutting furs. The worker recognized Clym, and Yeobright learnt from the voice that the speaker was Humphrey. Humphrey expressed his sorrow at Clym's condition, and added, "Now, if yours was low-class work like mine, you could go on with it just the same." "Yes, I could," said Yeobright musingly. "How much do you get for cutting these faggots?" "Half a crown 100, and in these long days I can live very well on the wages." During the whole of Yeobright's walk home to Alderworth, he was lost in reflections which were not of an unpleasant kind. On his coming up to the house, Eustacia spoke to him from the open window, and he went across to her. "Darling," he said, "I am much happier, and if my mother were reconciled to me and to you, I should, I think, be happy quite." "Oh, I fear that will never be," she said, looking afar with her beautiful stormy eyes. "How can you say, 'I am happier,' and nothing changed?" "It arises from my having at last discovered something I can do, and get a living at, in this time of misfortune." "Yes?" "I am going to be a furze and turf cutter." "Oh, no, Clym," she said, the slight hopefulness previously apparent in her face going off again, and leaving her worse than before. "Surely I shall. Is it not very unwise in us to go on spending the little money we've got, when I can keep down expenditure by an honest occupation? The outdoor exercise will do me good, and who knows but that in a few months I shall be able to go on with my reading again?" "But my grandfather offers to assist us if we require assistance." "We don't require it. If I go furze cutting, we shall be fairly well off." "Oh, in comparison with slaves, and the Israelites in Egypt, and such people?" A bitter tear rolled down Eustatia's face, which he did not see. There had been nonchalance in his tone, showing her that he felt no absolute grief at a consummation which to her was a positive horror. The very next day Yeobright went to Humphrey's cottage, and borrowed of him leggings, gloves, a whetstone, and a hook, to use till he should be able to purchase some for himself. Then he sallied forth with his new fellow-labourer and old acquaintance, and, selecting a spot where the firs grew thickest, he struck the first blow in his adopted calling. His sight, like the wings in Rasselas, though useless to him for his grand purpose, sufficed for this strait, and he found that when a little practice should have hardened his palms against blistering, he would be able to work with ease. Day after day he rose with the sun, buckled on his leggings, and went off to the rendezvous with Humphrey. His custom was to work from 4 o'clock in the morning till noon, then, when the heat of the day was at its highest, to go home and sleep for an hour or two, afterwards coming out again and working till dusk at 9. This man from Paris was now so disguised by his leather accoutrements and by the goggles he was obliged to wear over his eyes, that his closest friend might have passed by without recognizing him. He was a brown spot in the midst of an expanse of olive-green gorse, and nothing more. Though frequently depressed in spirit when not actually at work, owing to thoughts of Eustatia's position and his mother's estrangement, when in the full swing of labour he was cheerfully disposed and calm. His daily life was of a curious microscopic sort, his whole world being limited to a circuit of a few feet from his person. His familiars were creeping and winged things, and they seemed to enroll him in their band. Bees hummed around his ears with an intimate air, and tugged at the heath and furze flowers at his side in such numbers as to weigh them down to the sod. The strange amber-coloured butterflies which Egdon produced, and which were never seen elsewhere, quivered in the breath of his lips, alighted upon his bowed back, and sported with the glittering point of his hook as he flourished it up and down. Tribes of emerald-green grasshoppers leaped over his feet, falling awkwardly on their backs, heads, or hips, like unskilful acrobats, as chance might rule, or engaged themselves in noisy flirtations under the fern fronds with silent ones of homely hue. Huge flies, ignorant of larders and wire-netting, and quite in a savage state, buzzed about him without knowing that he was a man. In and out of the fern dells snakes glided in their most brilliant blue and yellow guise, it being the season immediately following the shedding of their old skins, when their colours are brightest. Litters of young rabbits came out from their forms to sun themselves upon hillocks, the hot beams blazing through the delicate tissue of each thin-fleshed ear, and firing it to a blood-red transparency in which the veins could be seen. None of them feared him. The monotony of his occupation soothed him, and was in itself a pleasure. A forced limitation of effort offered a justification of homely courses to an unambitious man, whose conscience would hardly have allowed him to remain in such obscurity while his powers were unimpeded. Hence Yeobright sometimes sang to himself, and when obliged to accompany Humphrey in search of brambles for faggot bonds, he would amuse his companion with sketches of Parisian life and character, and so while away the time. On one of these warm afternoons Eustatia walked out alone in the direction of Yeobright's place of work. He was busily chopping away at the firs, a long row of faggots which stretched downward from his position, representing the labour of the day. He did not observe her approach, and she stood close to him, and heard his undercurrent of song. It shocked her. To see him there, a poor afflicted man, earning money by the sweat of his brow, had at first moved her to tears, but to hear him sing, and not at all rebel, against an occupation which, however satisfactory to himself, was degrading to her as an educated lady-wife, wounded her through. Unconscious of her presence, he still went on singing. Le point du jour à nos bosquets rend toute leur parure. Flore est plus belle à son retour. L'oiseau reprend doux chant d'amour. Tout célèbre dans la nature le point du jour. Le point du jour cause parfois, cause douleur extrême. Que l'espace des nuits est court pour le berger brûlant d'amour, forcé de quitter ce qu'il aime, au point du jour. It was bitterly plain to Eustacia that he did not care much about social failure, and the proud fair woman bowed her head and wept in sick despair at thought of the blasting effect upon her own life of that mood and condition in him. Then she came forward. "I would starve rather than do it," she exclaimed vehemently. "And you can sing!" "I will go and live with my grandfather again." "Eustacia, I did not see you, though I noticed something moving," he said gently. He came forward, pulled off his huge leather glove, and took her hand. "Why do you speak in such a strange way? It is only a little old song, which struck my fancy when I was in Paris, and now just applies to my life with you. Has your love for me all died, then, because my appearance is no longer that of a fine gentleman? Dearest, you must not question me unpleasantly, or it may make me not love you." "Do you believe it is possible that I would run the risk of doing that?" "Well, you follow out your own ideas, and won't give in to mine when I wish you to leave off this shameful labor. Is there anything you dislike in me, that you act so contrarily to my wishes? I am your wife, and why will you not listen? Yes, I am your wife indeed." "I know what that tone means." "What tone?" "The tone in which you said, 'Your wife indeed.' It meant your wife worse luck." "It is hard in you to probe me with that remark. A woman may have reason, though she is not without heart. And if I felt worse luck, it was no ignoble feeling, it was only too natural. There you see that at any rate I do not attempt untruths. Do you remember how, before we were married, I warned you that I had not good wifely qualities?" "You mock me to say that now. On that point at least the only noble course would be to hold your tongue, for you are still queen of me, Eustacia, though I may no longer be king of you." "You are my husband. Does not that content you?" "Not unless you are my wife without regret." "Oh, I cannot answer you. I remember saying that I should be a serious matter on your hands." "Yes, I saw that." "Then you were too quick to see. No true lover would have seen any such thing. You are too severe upon me, Clem. I don't like your speaking so at all." "Well, I married you in spite of it, and don't regret doing so. How cold you seem this afternoon, and yet I used to think there never was a warmer heart than yours." "Yes, I fear we are cooling. I see it as well as you." She sighed mournfully. "And how madly we loved 2 months ago. You were never tired of contemplating me, nor I of contemplating you. Who could have thought then that by this time my eyes would not seem so very bright to yours, nor your lips so very sweet to mine? 2 months! Is it possible? Oh, yes, 'tis too true." You sigh, dear, as if you were sorry for it, and that's a hopeful sign. No, I don't sigh for that. There are other things for me to sigh for, or any other woman in my place. That your chances in life are ruined by marrying in haste an unfortunate man. Why will you force me, Clem, to say bitter things? I deserve pity as much as you. As much, I think I deserve it more. For you can sing. It would be a strange hour which would catch me singing under such a cloud as this. Believe me, sweet, I could weep to a degree that would astonish and confound such an elastic mind as yours. Even had you felt careless about your own affliction, you might have refrained from singing out of sheer pity for mine. God, if I were a man in such a position, I would curse rather than sing. Yeobright placed his hand upon her arm. Now don't you suppose, my inexperienced girl, that I cannot rebel, in high Promethean fashion, against the gods and fate as well as you? I have felt more steam and smoke of that sort than you have ever heard of. But the more I see of life, the more do I perceive that there is nothing particularly great in its greatest walks, and therefore nothing particularly small in mine of furze-cutting. If I feel that the greatest blessings vouchsafed to us are not very valuable, how can I feel it to be any great hardship when they are taken away? So I sing to pass the time. Have you indeed lost all tenderness for me, that you begrudge me a few cheerful moments? I still have some tenderness left for you. Your words have no longer their old flavour, and so love dies with good fortune. Oh, I cannot listen to this, Clem. It will end bitterly, she said in a broken voice. I will go home. End of chapter 2.